The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell, with Bill Moyers, abridged, read by Vincent Bagnall. For weeks after Joseph Campbell died, I was reminded of him just about everywhere I turned, coming up from the subway at Times Square and feeling the energy of the pressing crowd. I smiled to myself upon remembering the image that once had appeared to Campbell there, the latest incarnation of Oedipus, the continued romance of Beauty and the Beast, stands this afternoon on the corner of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue, waiting for the traffic light to change. At a preview of John Huston's last film, The Dead, based on a story of James Joyce, I thought again of Joseph Campbell. One of his first important works was a key to Finnegan's Wake, what Joyce called the grave and constant in human sufferings. Campbell knew to be a principal theme of classic mythology. The secret cause of all suffering, he said, is mortality itself, which is the prime condition of life. It cannot be denied if life is to be affirmed. Campbell died just before the 24th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination, a tragedy he had discussed in mythological terms during our first meeting years earlier. And now, as that melancholy remembrance came around again, I sat talking with my grown children about Campbell's reflections, a solemn state funeral he had described as an illustration of the high service of ritual to a society, evoking mythological themes rooted in human need. And this was a ritualized occasion of the greatest social necessity, Campbell had written, the public murder of a president, representing our whole society, the living social organism of which ourselves were the members, taken away at a moment of exuberant life, required a compensatory right to reestablish the sense of solidarity. Here was an enormous nation, those 4 days, into a unanimous community, all of us participating in the same way, simultaneously, in a single symbolic event. He said it was the first and only thing of its kind in peacetime that has ever given me the sense of being a member of this whole national community, engaged as a unit in the observance of a deeply significant rite. Myth and the Modern World. People say that what we're all seeking is a meaning for life. I don't think that's what we're really seeking. I think that what we're seeking is an experience of being alive, so that our life experiences on the purely physical plane will have resonances within our own innermost being and reality, so that we actually feel the rapture of being alive. A conversation between Bill Moyers and Joseph Campbell. Moyers: what myths, what should we care about myths? What do they have to do with life? Campbell: my first response would be, go on, live your life. It's a good life. You don't need mythology. I don't believe in being interested in a subject just because it's said to be important. I believe in being caught by it somehow or other. But you may find that with a proper introduction, mythology will catch you. And so, what can it do for you if it does catch you? One of our problems today is that we are not well acquainted with the literature of the spirit. We're interested in the news of the day and the problems of the hour. It used to be that the university campus was a kind of hermetically sealed-off area where the news of the day did not impinge upon your attention to the inner life and to the magnificent human heritage we have in our great tradition: Plato, Confucius, the Buddha, Goethe, and others who speak of the eternal values that have to do with the centering of our lives. When you get to be older and the concerns of the day have all been attended to, and you turn to the inner life, well, if you don't know where it is or what it is, you'll be sorry. Greek and Latin in biblical literature used to be part of everyone's education. Now, when these were dropped, a whole tradition of Occidental mythological information was lost. It used to be that these stories were in the minds of people. When the story is in our mind, then you see its relevance to something happening in your own life. It gives you perspective of what's happening to you. And with the loss of that, we've really lost something because we don't have a comparable literature to take its place. And these bits of information from ancient times, which have to do with the themes that have supported human life, built civilizations and informed religions over the millennia, have to do with deep inner problems, inner mysteries, inner thresholds of passage. And if you don't know what the guide signs are along the way, you have to work it out yourself. But once this subject catches you, there is such a feeling from one or another of these traditions of information of a deep, rich, life-vivifying sort that you don't want to give it up. So we tell stories to try to come in terms with the world, to harmonize our lives with reality. I think so, yes. Novels, great novels, can be wonderfully instructive. In my 20s and 30s, and even on into my 40s, James Joyce and Thomas Mann were my teachers. I read everything they wrote. Both were writing in terms of what might be called the mythological traditions. Take, for example, the story of Tonio in Thomas Mann's Tonio Kruger. Tonio's father was a substantial businessman, a major citizen in his hometown. Little Tonio, however, had an artistic temperament, so he moved to Munich and joined a group of literary people who felt themselves above the mere money earners and family men. So here is Tonio between two poles. His father, who was a good father, responsible and all of that, but who never did the thing he wanted in all his life, and on the other hand, the one who leaves his hometown and becomes a critic of that kind of life. But Tonio found that he really loved these hometown people, and although he thought himself a little superior in an intellectual way to them and could describe them with cutting words, his heart was nevertheless with them. But when he left to live with the Bohemians, he found that they were so disdainful of life that he couldn't stay with them either. So he left them and wrote a letter back to someone in the group saying, "I admire those cold, proud beings who adventure upon the paths of great and daemonic beauty and despise mankind, but I do not envy them. For if anything is capable of making a poet of a literary man, it is my hometown love of the human, the living, and ordinary. All warmth derives from this love, all kindness and all humor. Indeed, to me it even seems that this must be that love of which it is written, that one may speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and yet, lacking love, be as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal." And then he says, the writer must be true to truth, and that's a killer, because the only way you can describe a human being truly is by describing his imperfections. The perfect human being is uninteresting. The Buddha who leaves the world, it is the imperfections of life that are lovable. And when the writer sends a dart of the true word, it hurts. But it goes with love. And this is what Mann called erotic irony, the love for that which you are killing with your cruel, analytical word. I cherish that image, my hometown love, the feeling you get for that place, no matter how long you've been away or even if you never return. That was where you first discovered people. But why do you say you love people for their imperfections? Aren't children lovable because they're falling down all the time and have little bodies with the heads too big? Didn't Walt Disney know all about this when he did the Seven Dwarfs? And these funny little dogs that people have, they're lovable because they're so imperfect. Well, perfection would be a bore, wouldn't it? It would have to be. It would be inhuman. The umbilical point, the humanity, the thing that makes you human and not supernatural and immortal, that's what's lovable. And that is why some people have a very hard time loving God, because there's no imperfection there. You can be in awe, but that would not be real love. It's Christ on the cross that becomes lovable. What do you mean? Suffering. Suffering is imperfection, is it not? The story of human suffering, striving, living, and youth coming to knowledge of itself, what it has to go through. I came to understand from reading your books, The Masks of God or The Hero with a Thousand Faces, for example, that What human beings have in common is revealed in myths. Myths are stories of our search through the ages for truth, for meaning, for significance. We all need to tell our story and to understand our story. We all need to understand death and to cope with death, and we all need help in our passages from birth to life and then to death. We need for life to signify, to touch the eternal, to understand the mysterious, to find out who we are. People say that what we're all seeking is a meaning for life. I don't think that's what we're really seeking. I think that what we're seeking is an experience of being alive, so that our life experiences on the purely physical plane will have resonances with our own innermost being and reality, so that we actually feel the rapture of being alive. And that's what it's all finally about. And that's what these clues help us to find within ourselves. Myths are clues. Myths are clues to the spiritual potentialities of the human life. What we're capable of knowing and experiencing within? Yes. Now, you've changed the definition of a myth from the search for meaning to the experience of meaning. Experience of life. The mind has to do with meaning. What's the meaning of a flower? There's a Zen story about a sermon of the Buddha in which he simply lifted a flower. There was only one man who gave him a sign with his eyes that he understood what was said. Now, the Buddha himself is called the One Thus Come. There's no meaning. What's the meaning of the universe? What's the meaning of a flea? It's just there. That's it. And your own meaning is that you're there. We're so engaged in doing things to achieve purposes of outer value that we forget that the inner value, the rapture that is associated with being alive, is what it's all about. How do you get that experience? Read myths. They teach you that you can turn inward, and you begin to get the message of the symbols. Read other people's myths, not those of your own religion, because you tend to interpret your own religion in terms of facts. But if you read the other ones, you begin to get the message. Myth helps you to put your mind in touch with this experience of being alive. It tells you what the experience is. Marriage, for example. What is marriage? The myth tells you what it is. It's the reunion of the separated duad. Originally, you were one. You are now two in the world. But the recognition of the spiritual identity is what marriage is. It's different from a love affair. It has nothing to do with that. It's another mythological plane of experience. When people get married because they think it's a long-time love affair, they'll be divorced very soon, because all love affairs end in disappointment. But marriage is recognition of a spiritual identity. If we live a proper life, if our minds are on the right qualities in regarding the person of the opposite sex, we will find our proper male or female counterpart. But if we are distracted by certain sensuous interests, we'll marry the wrong person. By marrying the right person, we reconstruct the image of the incarnate God. And that's what marriage is. The right person. How does one choose the right person? Your heart tells you. It ought to. Your inner being. That's the mystery. You recognize your other self. Well, I don't know, but there's a flash that comes and something in you knows that this is the one. If marriage is this reunion of the self, with the male or female grounding of ourselves, why is it that marriage is so precarious in our modern society? Because it's not regarded as a marriage. I would say that if the marriage isn't a first priority in your life, you're not married. The marriage means the two that are one. The two become one flesh. If the marriage lasts long enough, and if you are acquiescing constantly to it instead of to individual personal whim, you come to realize that This is true. The two really are one. One not only biologically, but spiritually. Primarily spiritually. The biological is the distraction, which may lead you to the wrong identification. Then the necessary function of marriage, perpetuating ourselves in children, is not the primary one. No, that's really just the elementary aspect of marriage. There are two completely different stages of marriage. First is the youthful marriage following the wonderful impulse that nature has given us in the interplay of the sexes biologically in order to produce children. But there comes a time when the child graduates from the family and the couple is left. I've been amazed at the number of my friends who in their 40s or 50s go apart. They've had a perfectly decent life together with a child, but they interpreted their union in terms of their relationship through the child. They did not interpret it in terms of their own personal relationship to each other. Marriage is a relationship. When you make the sacrifice in marriage, you're sacrificing not to each other, but to unity in a relationship. The Chinese image of the Tao, with the dark and light interacting, that's the relationship of yang and yin, male and female, which is what a marriage is. And that's what you have become when you have married. You're no longer this one alone. Your identity is in a relationship. Marriage is not a simple love affair. It's an ordeal. And the ordeal is the sacrifice of ego to a relationship in which two have become one. So marriage is utterly incompatible with the idea of doing one's own thing. It's not simply one's own thing, you see. It is, in a sense, doing one's own thing, but the one isn't just you. It's the two together as one, and that's a purely mythological image signifying the sacrifice of the visible entity for a transcendent good. And this is something that becomes beautifully realized in the second stage of marriage, what I call the alchemical stage of the two experiencing that they are one. If they are still living as they were in the primary stage of marriage, they will go apart when their children leave. Daddy will fall in love with some little nubile girl and run off, and mother will be left with an empty house and heart, and will have to work it out on her own, in her own way. But that's because we don't understand the two levels of marriage. We don't make a commitment. We presume to. We make a commitment for better or for worse. That's the remnant of a ritual. And the ritual has lost its force. The ritual that once conveyed an inner reality is now merely form. And that's true in the rituals of society and the personal rituals of marriage and religion. How many people before marriage receive spiritual instruction as to what the marriage means? You can stand up in front of a judge and in 10 minutes get married. The marriage ceremony in India lasts 3 days. That couple is glued. You're saying that marriage is not just a social arrangement, it's a spiritual exercise. It's primarily a spiritual exercise, and the society is supposed to help us have the realization. Man should not be in the service of society. Society should be in the service of man. When man is in the service of society, you have a monster state, and that's what is threatening the world at this moment. What happens when a society no longer embraces a powerful mythology? What we've got on our hands. If you want to find out what it means to have a society without any rituals, read the New York Times. And you'd find the news of the day, including destructive and violent acts by young people who don't know how to behave in a civilized society. Society has provided them no rituals by which they become members of the tribe, of the community. All children need to be twice born to learn to function rationally in the present world, leaving childhood behind. I think of that passage in the first book of Corinthians. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. That's exactly it. That's the significance of the puberty rites. In primal societies, there are teeth knocked out, there are scarifications, there are circumcisions, there are all kinds of things done, so you don't have your little baby body anymore. You're something else entirely. When I was a kid, we wore short trousers, knee pants. And then there was a great moment when you put on long pants. Boys now don't get that. I see even 5-year-olds walking around with long trousers. When are they going to know that they're now men and must put aside childish things? Where do the kids growing up in the city on 125th and Broadway, for example, where do these kids get their myths today? They make them up themselves. This is why we have graffiti all over the city. These kids have their own gangs and their own initiations and their own morality, and they're doing the best they can. But they're dangerous because their own laws are not those of this city. They have not been initiated into our society. Rollo May says there is so much violence in American society today because there are no more great myths to help young men and women relate to the world, or to understand that world beyond what is seen. Yes, but another reason for the high level of violence here is that America has no ethos. Explain. In American football, for example, the rules are very strict and complex. If you were to go to England, however, you would find that the rugby rules are not that strict. When I was a student back in the 20s, there were a couple of young men who constituted a marvelous forward-passing pair. They went to Oxford on scholarship and joined the rugby team. And one day, they introduced the forward pass. And the English players said, "We don't play that way." Now, in a culture that has been homogeneous for some time, there are a number of understood, unwritten rules by which people live, and there is an ethos there. There is a mode, an understanding that we don't do it that way. A mythology, an unstated mythology, you might say. This is the way we use a fork and knife. This is the way we deal with people and so forth. It's not all written down in books. But in America, we have people from all kinds of backgrounds, all in a cluster together, and consequently law has become very important in this country. Lawyers and law are what hold us together. There is no ethos. Do you see what I mean? Yes, it's what de Tocqueville described when he first arrived here 160 years ago to discover a tumult of anarchy. What we have today is a demythologized world. And as a result, the students I meet are very much interested in mythology because myths bring them messages. Now, I can't tell you what the messages are that the study of mythology is bringing to young people today. I know what it did for me, but it is doing something for them. When I go to lecture at any college, the room is bursting with students who have come to hear what I have to say. The faculty very often assigns me to a room that's a little smaller than it should have been, because they didn't know how much excitement there was going to be in the student body. Take a guess. What do you think the mythology, the stories they're going to hear from you, do for them? They're stories about the wisdom of life. They really are. What we're learning in our schools is not the wisdom of life. We're learning technologies, we're getting information. There's a curious reluctance on the part of faculties to indicate the life values of their subjects. In our sciences today, and this includes anthropology, linguistics, the study of religions, and so forth, there's a tendency to specialization. And when you know how much a specialist scholar has to know in order to be a competent specialist, you can understand the tendency. To study Buddhism, for instance, you have to be able to handle not only all the European languages in which the discussions of the Oriental come, particularly French, German, English, and Italian, but also Sanskrit, Chinese, Japanese, Tibetan, and several other languages. Now, this is a tremendous task. Such a specialist can't also be wondering about the difference between the Iroquois and the Algonquin. Specialization tends to limit the field of problems that the specialist is concerned with. Now, the person who isn't a specialist, but a generalist like myself, sees something over here that he has learned from one specialist, something over there that he has learned from another specialist. And neither of them has considered the problem of why this occurs here and also there. So the generalist, and that's a derogatory term, by the way, for academics, gets into a range of other problems that are more genuinely human, you might say, than specifically cultural. Then along comes the journalist who has a license to explain things he doesn't understand. That is not only a license, but something that is put upon him. He has an obligation to educate himself in public. Now, I remember when I was a young man going to hear Heinrich Zimmer lecture. He was the first man I know of to speak about myths as though they had messages that were valid for life, not just interesting things for scholars to fool around with. And that confirmed me in a feeling I had had ever since boyhood. Do you remember the first time you discovered myth? The first time the story came alive in you? I was brought up as a Roman Catholic. Now, one of the great advantages of being brought up a Roman Catholic is that you're taught to take myths seriously. I was brought up in terms of the seasonal relationships to the cycle of Christ's coming into the world, teaching in the world, dying, resurrecting, and returning to heaven. The ceremonies all through the year keep you in mind of the eternal core of all that changes in time. Sin is simply getting out of touch with that harmony. And then I fell in love with the American Indians because Buffalo Bill used to come to Madison Square Garden every year with his marvelous Wild West show. And I wanted to know more about Indians. My father and mother were very generous parents and found what books were being written for boys about Indians at the time. So I began to read American Indian myths, and it wasn't long before I found the same motifs in the American Indian stories that I was being taught by the nuns at school. Creation, death, resurrection, ascension to heaven, virgin births. I didn't know what it was, but I recognized the vocabulary, one after another. And what happened? I was excited. That was the beginning of my interest in comparative mythology. Did you begin by asking, what does it say in this way while the Bible says it that way? No, I didn't start the comparative analysis until many years later. What appealed to you about the Indian stories? In those days, there was still American Indian lore in the air. Indians were still around. Even now, when I deal with myths from all parts of the world, I find the American Indian tales and narratives to be very rich, very well developed. And then, my parents had a place out in the woods where the Delaware Indians had lived, and the Iroquois had come down and fought them. There was a big ledge where we could dig for Indian arrowheads and things like that, and the very animals that play the role in the Indian stories were there in the woods around me. It was a grand introduction. Did these stories begin to collide with your Catholic faith? No, there was no collision. The collision with my religion came much later in relation to scientific studies and things of that kind. Later I became interested in Hinduism, and there were the same stories again. And in my graduate work, I was dealing with the Arthurian medieval material, and there were the same stories again. So you can't tell me that they're not the same stories. I've been with them all my life. They come from every culture, but with timeless themes. The themes are timeless, and the inflection is to the culture. So the stories may take the same universal theme, but apply it slightly differently, depending upon the accent of the people who are speaking. Oh yes, if you were not alert to the parallel themes, you perhaps would think they were quite different stories, but they're not. You taught mythology for 38 years at Sarah Lawrence. How did you get these young women coming to college from their middle-class backgrounds, from their orthodox religions, how did you get them interested in myths? Young people just grab this stuff. Mythology teaches you what's behind literature and the arts. It teaches you about your own life. It's a great, exciting, life-nourishing subject. Mythology has a great deal to do with the stages of life, the initiation ceremonies as you move from childhood to adult responsibilities, from the unmarried state into the married state. All of those rituals are mythological rites, and they have to do with your recognition of the new role that you're in, the process of throwing off the old one and coming out in the new. and entering into a responsible profession. When a judge walks into the room and everybody stands up, you're not standing up to that guy. You're standing up to the robe that he's wearing and the role that he's going to play. What makes him worthy of that role is his integrity as a representative of the principles of that role and not some group of prejudices of his own. So what you're standing up to is a mythological character. I imagine some kings and queens are the most stupid, absurd, banal people you could run into, probably interested only in horses and women, But you're not responding to them as personalities. You're responding to them in their mythological roles. When someone becomes a judge or president of the United States, the man is no longer that man. He's the representative of an eternal office. He has to sacrifice his personal desires and even life possibilities to the role that he now signifies. So there are mythological rituals at work in our society. The ceremony of marriage is one. The ceremony of the inauguration of a president or judge is another. What are some of the other rituals that are important to society today? Joining the army, putting on a uniform is another. You're giving up your personal life and accepting a socially determined manner of life in the service of the society of which you are a member. This is why I think it is obscene to judge people in terms of civil law for performances that they rendered in time of war. They were acting not as individuals, they were acting as agents of something above them and to which they had, by dedication, given themselves. To judge them as though they were individual human beings is totally improper. You've seen what happens when primitive societies are unsettled by white man civilization. They go to pieces, they disintegrate, they become diseased. Hasn't the same thing been happening to us since our myths began to disappear? Absolutely it has. Isn't that why conservative religions today are calling for the old-time religion? Yes, and they're making a terrible mistake. They are going back to something that is vestigial, that doesn't serve life. But didn't it serve us? Sure it did. I understand the yearning. In my youth I had fixed stars. They comforted me with their permanence. They gave me a known horizon, and they told me there was a loving, kind, and just Father out there looking down on me, ready to receive me, thinking of my concerns all the time. Now, Saul Bellow says that science has made a house cleaning of beliefs. But there was value in these things for me. I am today what I am because of those beliefs. I wonder what happens to children who don't have those fixed stars, that known horizon, those myths. Well, as I said, all you have to do is read the newspaper. It's a mess. The Power of Myth, Part 2. The Journey Inward. One thing that comes out in myths is that at the bottom of the abyss comes the voice of salvation. The black moment is the moment when the real message of transformation is going to come. At the darkest moment comes the light. Someone asked me, why are you drawn to these myths? What do you see in what Joseph Campbell is saying? And I answered, these myths speak to me because they express what I know inside is true. Why is this so? Why does it seem that these stories tell me what I know inside is true? Does that come from the ground of my being, the unconscious that I have inherited from all that has come before me? That's right, you've got the same body with the same organs and energies that Cro-Magnon man had 30,000 years ago. Living a human life in New York City or living a human life in the caves, you go through the same stages of childhood, coming to sexual maturity, transformation of the dependency of childhood into the responsibility of manhood or womanhood, marriage, then failure of the body, gradual loss of its powers, and death. You have the same body, the same bodily experiences, and so you respond to the same images. For example, a constant image is that of the conflict of the eagle and the serpent. The serpent, bound to the earth, the eagle, in spiritual flight. Isn't that conflict something we all experience? And then when the two amalgamate, we get a wonderful dragon, a serpent with wings. All over the earth, people recognize these images. Whether I'm reading Polynesian or Iroquois or Egyptian myths, the images are the same, and they're talking about the same problems. They just wear different costumes when they appear at different times. Yes, it's as though the same play were taken from one place to another, and at each place the local players put on local costumes and enact the same old play. And these mythic images are carried forward from generation to generation almost unconsciously. Well, that's utterly fascinating because they are speaking about the deep mystery of yourself and everything else. It's a mysterium, a mystery. Tremendum e fascinans. Tremendous, horrific, because it smashes all of your fixed notion of things and at the same time utterly fascinating because it's of your own nature and being. When you start thinking about these things, about the inner mystery, inner life, the eternal life, there aren't too many images for you to use. You begin on your own to have the images that are already present in some other system of thought. There was a sense during medieval times of reading the world as if the world had messages for you. Oh, it certainly does. The myths help you read the messages. They tell you the typical probabilities. Give me an example. One thing that comes out in myths, for example, is that at the bottom of the abyss comes the voice of salvation. The black moment is the moment when the real message of transformation is going to come. At the darkest moment comes the light. Like Rothke's poem, "In a dark time the eye begins to see." You're saying that myths have brought this consciousness to you. I live with these myths, and they tell me this all the time. This is the problem that can be metaphorically understood as identifying with the Christ in you. The Christ in you doesn't lie. The Christ in you survives death and resurrects. Or you can identify that with Shiva. I am Shiva. This is the great meditation of the yogis in the Himalayas. And heaven, that desired goal of most people, is within us. Heaven and hell are within us, and all the gods are within us. This is the great realization of the Upanishads of India in the 9th century BC. All the gods, all the heavens, all the worlds are within us. They are magnified dreams, and dreams are manifestations in image form of the energies of the body in conflict with each other. That is what myth is. Myth is a manifestation in symbolic images, in metaphorical images, of the energies of the organs of the body in conflict with each other. This organ wants this, that organ wants that. The brain is one of the organs. So when we dream, we are fishing in some vast ocean of mythology that goes down and down and down. You can get all mixed up with complexes, things like that. But really, as the Polynesian saying goes, you are then standing on a whale fishing for minnows. We are standing on a whale. The ground of being is the ground of our being. And when we simply turn outward, we see all of these little problems here and there. But if we look inward, we see that we are the source of them all. You talk about mythology existing here and now in dream time. What is dream time? This is the time you get into when you go to sleep and have a dream that talks about permanent conditions within your own psyche as they relate to the temporal conditions of your life right now. Explain that. For example, you may be worried about whether you are going to pass an exam. Then you have a dream of some kind of failure, and you find that failure will be associated with many other failures in your life. They're all piled up together there. Freud says even the most fully expounded dream is not really fully expounded. The dream is an inexhaustible source of spiritual information about yourself. Now, the level of dream of will I pass the exam or should I marry this girl, that is purely personal. But on another level, the problem of passing an exam is not simply a personal problem. Everyone has to pass a threshold of some kind. That is an archetypal thing. So there's a basic mythological theme there, even though it is a personal dream. And these two levels, the personal aspect and then the big general problem, of which the person's problem is a local example, are found in all cultures. For example, everyone has the problem of facing death. This is a standard mystery. What do we learn from our dreams? You learn about yourself. How do we pay attention to our dreams? All you have to do is remember your dream in the first place and write it down. Then take one little fraction of the dream, one or two images or ideas, and associate with them. Write down what comes to your mind, and again what comes to your mind, and again. You'll find that the dream is based on a body of experiences that have some kind of significance in your life and that you didn't know were influencing you. Soon the next dream will come along, and your interpretation will go further. A man once told me that he didn't remember dreaming until he retired. And suddenly, having no place to focus his energy, he began to dream and dream and dream. Do you think that we tend to overlook the significance of dreaming in our modern society? Ever since Freud's interpretation of dreams was published, there's been a recognition of the importance of dreams. But even before that, there were dream interpretations. People had superstitious notions about dreams. For example, something is going to happen because I dreamed it is going to happen. Why is a myth different from a dream? Oh, because a dream is a personal experience of that deep, dark ground that is the support of our conscious lives, and a myth is the society's dream. The myth is the public dream, and the dream is the private myth. If your private myth, your dream, happens to coincide with that of the society, you're in good accord with your group. If it isn't, you've got an adventure in the dark forest ahead of you. So if my private dreams are in accord with the public mythology, I'm more likely to live healthily in that society. But if my private dreams are out of step with the public, you'll be in trouble. If you're forced to live in that system, you'll be a neurotic. But aren't many visionaries and even leaders and heroes close to the edge of neuroticism? Yes, they are. How do you explain that? They've moved out of the society that would have protected them and into the dark forest, into the world of fire, of original experience. Original experience has not been interpreted for you, and so you've got to work out your life for yourself. Either you can take it or you can't. You don't have to go far off the interpreted path to find yourself in very difficult situations. The courage to face the trials and to bring a whole new body of possibilities into the field of interpreted experience for other people to experience, that is the hero's deed. You say dreams come up from the psyche. I don't know where else they come from. I mean, they come from the imagination, don't they? The imagination is grounded in the energy of the organs of the body, and these are the same in all human beings. Since imagination comes out of one biological ground, it is bound to produce certain themes. Dreams are dreams. There are certain characteristics of dreams that can be enumerated, no matter who is dreaming them. I think of a dream as something very private, while a myth is something very public. On some levels, a private dream runs into truly mythic themes and can't be interpreted except by an analogy with a myth. Jung speaks of two orders of dream, the personal dream and the archetypal dream, or the dream of mythic dimension. You can interpret a personal dream by association, figuring out what it is talking about in your own life or in relation to your own personal problem. But every now and then a dream comes up that is pure myth, that carries a mythic theme, or that is said, for example, to come from the Christ within. From the archetypal person within us, the archetypal self, we are. That's right. Now there is another deeper meaning of dream time, which is of a time that is no time, just an enduring state of being. There's an important myth from Indonesia that tells of this mythological age and its termination. In the beginning, according to this story, the ancestors were not distinguished as to sex. There were no births, there were no deaths. Then, a great public dance was celebrated. And in the course of the dance, one of the participants was trampled to death and torn to pieces, and the pieces were buried. At the moment of that killing, the sexes became separated, so that death was now balanced by begetting by death. While from the buried parts of the dismembered body, food plants grew. Time had come into being, death, birth, and the killing and eating of other living beings for the preservation of life. The timeless time of the beginning had been terminated by a communal crime, a deliberate murder, or sacrifice. Now, one of the main problems of mythology is reconciling the mind to this brutal precondition of all life, which lives by the killing and eating of lives. You don't kid yourself by eating only vegetables, either, for they, too, are alive. So the essence of life is this eating of itself. Life lives on lives, and the reconciliation of the human mind and sensibilities to that fundamental fact is one of the functions of some of those very brutal rites in which the ritual consists chiefly of killing, in imitation, as it were, of that first primordial crime out of which arose this temporal world in which we all participate. The reconciliation of mind to the conditions of life is fundamental to all creation stories. They're very like each other in this respect. But take the creation story in Genesis, for example. How is it like other stories? Well, you read from Genesis, and I'll read from creation stories in other cultures, and we'll see. Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And this is from the Song of the World, a legend of the Pima Indians of Arizona. In the beginning, there was only darkness everywhere, darkness and water. And the darkness gathered thick in places, crowding together and then separating, crowding and separating. In Genesis 1, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And this is from the Hindu Upanishads, from about the 8th century BC. In the beginning, there was only the great self reflected in the form of a person. Reflecting, it found nothing but itself. Then, its first word was, "This am I." Genesis 1, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply." And now this is from a legend of the Basari people of West Africa. Onumbota made a human being. Its name was man. Onumbota next made an antelope, named Antelope. Onumbota made a snake, named Snake, and Onumbota said to them, "The earth has not yet been pounded. You must pound the ground smooth where you are sitting." Onumbota gave seeds of all kinds and said, "Go plant these." Genesis 2, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work which he had done. And now again from the Pima Indians, "I make the world, and lo, the world is finished. Thus I make the world, and lo, the world is finished." And Genesis 1, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And from the Upanishads, then he realized, "I indeed, I am this creation, for I have poured it forth from myself." In that way, he became this creation. Verily, he who knows this becomes in this creation a creator. And this is the clincher here. When you know this, then you have identified with the creative principle, which is the God power in the world, which means in you. It is beautiful. But Genesis continues, "Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" The man said, "The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent beguiled me, and I ate." You talk about buck passing, it starts very early. Yes, it's been tough on serpents. The Basari legend continues in the same way. One day Snake said, "We too should eat these fruits." "Why must we go hungry?" Antelope said, "But we don't know anything about this fruit." Then man and his wife took some of the fruit and ate it. Unumboti came down from the sky and asked, "Who ate the fruit?" They answered, "We did." Unumboti asked, "Who told you that you could eat that fruit?" They replied, "Snake did." It is very much the same story. What do you make of it, that in these two stories the principal actors point to someone else as the initiator of the fall? Yes, but it turns out to be the snake. In both of these stories, the snake is the symbol of life throwing off the past and continuing to live. Why? The power of life causes the snake to shed its skin, just as the moon sheds its shadow. The serpent sheds its skin to be born again, as the moon, its shadow, to be born again. They are equivalent symbols. Sometimes the serpent is represented as a circle eating its own tail. That's an image of life. Life sheds one generation after another to be born again. The serpent represents immortal energy and consciousness engaged in the field of time, constantly throwing off death and being born again. And there is something tremendously terrifying about life when you look at it that way. And so the serpent carries in itself the sense of both the fascination and the terror of life. Furthermore, the serpent represents the primary function of life, mainly eating. And life consists in eating other creatures. You don't think about that very much when you make a nice-looking meal. But what you're doing is eating something that was recently alive. And when you look at the beauty of nature and you see the birds picking around, they're eating things. You see the cows grazing, they're eating things. The serpent is a traveling alimentary canal. That's about all it is. And it gives you that primary sense of shock, of life in its most primal quality. And there's no arguing with that animal at all. Life lives by killing and eating itself, casting off death and being reborn like the moon. This is one of the mysteries that these symbolic, paradoxical forms try to represent. Now, the snake in most cultures is given a positive interpretation. In India, even the most poisonous snake, the cobra, is a sacred animal, and the mythological serpent king is the next thing to the Buddha. The serpent represents the power of life engaged in the field of time and of death, yet eternally alive. The world is but its shadow, the falling skin. The serpent was revered in the American Indian traditions, too. The serpent was thought of as a very important power to be made friends with. Go down to the Pueblos, for example, and watch the snake dance of the Hopi, where they take the snakes in their mouths and make friends with them and then send them back to the hills. The snakes are sent back to carry the human message to the hills, just as they have brought the message of the hills to the humans. The interplay of man and nature is illustrated in this relationship with the serpent. A serpent flows like water, and so is watery, but its tongue continually flashes fire, so you have the pair of opposites together in the serpent. But in the Christian story, the serpent is the seducer. That amounts to a refusal to affirm life. In the biblical tradition we have inherited, life is corrupt and every natural impulse is sinful unless it has been circumcised or baptized. The serpent was the one who brought sin into the world, and the woman was the one who handed the apple to man. This identification of the woman with sin, of the serpent with sin, and thus of life with sin, is the twist that has been given to the whole story in the biblical myth and doctrine of the fall. Does the idea of woman as sinner appear in other mythologies? No, I don't know of it elsewhere. The closest thing to it would be perhaps Pandora with Pandora's box, but that's not sin, that's just trouble. The idea in the biblical tradition of the fall is that nature as we know it is corrupt. Sex in itself is corrupt, and the female, as the epitome of sex, is a corrupter. Why was the knowledge of good and evil forbidden to Adam and Eve? Without that knowledge, we'd all be a bunch of babies still in Eden without any participation in life. Woman brings life into the world. Eve is the mother of this temporal world. Formerly, you had a dreamtime paradise there in the Garden of Eden. No time, no birth, no death, no life. The serpent, who dies and is resurrected, shredding its skin and renewing its life, is the Lord of the central tree, where time and eternity come together. He is the primary God, actually, in the Garden of Eden. Yahweh, the one who walks there in the cool of the evening, is just a visitor. The garden is the serpent's place. It is an old, old story. We have Sumerian seals from as early as 3,500 BC showing the serpent and the tree and the goddess, with the goddess giving the fruit of life to a visiting male. The old mythology of the goddess is right there. Now, I saw a fantastic thing in a movie years and years ago of a Burmese snake priestess who had to bring rain to her people by climbing up a mountain path, calling a king cobra from his den, and actually kissing him 3 times on the nose. Now, there was the cobra, the giver of life, the giver of rain, as a divine positive figure, not a negative one. But how do you explain the difference between that image and the image of the snake in Genesis? There is actually a historical explanation based on the coming of the Hebrews into Canaan and their subjugation of the people of Canaan. The principal divinity of the people of Canaan was the goddess, and associated with the goddess is the serpent. And this is the symbol of the mystery of life. The male god-oriented group rejected it. In other words, there is a historical rejection of the mother goddess implied in the story of the Garden of Eden. But it does seem that this story has done women a great disservice by casting Eve as responsible for the fall. Well, why are women the ones held responsible for the downfall? Well, they represent life. Man doesn't enter life except by a woman, and so it is a woman who brings us into this world of pairs of opposites and suffering. But what is the myth of Adam and Eve trying to tell us about the pairs of opposites? What is the meaning? It started with the sin. You see, in other words, moving out of the mythological dreamtime zone of the Garden of Paradise, where there is no time, and where men and women don't even know that they are different from each other. The two are just creatures. God and man are practically the same. God walks in the cool of the evening in the garden where they are, and then they eat the apple, the knowledge of the opposites. And when they discover they are different, the man and woman cover their shame. You see, they had not thought of themselves as opposites. Male and female is one opposition. Another opposition is the human and God. Good and evil is a third opposition. The primary oppositions are the sexual and that between human beings and God. And then comes the idea of good and evil in the world. And so Adam and Eve have thrown themselves out of the garden of timeless unity, you might say, just by that act of recognizing duality. To move out into the world, you have to act in terms of pairs of opposites. There's a Hindu image that shows a triangle, which is the mother goddess, and a dot in the center of the triangle, which is the energy of the transcendent entering the field of time. And then, from this triangle, there comes pairs of triangles in all directions. Out of one comes two. All things in the field of time are pairs of opposites. So this is the shift of consciousness from the consciousness of identity to the consciousness of participation in duality. And then you are into the field of time. Is the story trying to tell us that prior to what happened in the garden to destroy us, there was a unity of life? It's a matter of planes of consciousness. It doesn't have to do with anything that happened. There is the plane of consciousness where you can identify yourself with that which transcends pairs of opposites, which is unnameable. Unnameable, it is transcendent of all names. God. God is an ambiguous word in our language because it appears to refer to something that is known. But the transcendent is unknowable and unknown. God is transcendent, finally, of anything like the name God. God is beyond names and forms. Meister Eckhart said that the ultimate and highest leave-taking is leaving God for God, leaving your notion of God for an experience of that which transcends all notions. The mystery of life is beyond all human conception. Everything we know is within the terminology of the concepts of being and not being, many and single, true and untrue. We always think in terms of opposites, but God, the ultimate, is beyond the pairs of opposites. And that is all there is to it. Why do you think in terms of opposites? Because we can't think otherwise. But that's the nature of reality in our time. That's the nature of our experience of reality. Man, woman, life, death, good, evil. I and you, this and that, true and untrue. Every one of them has its opposite. But mythology suggests that behind that duality, there is a singularity over which this plays like a shadow game. Eternity is in love with the productions of time, says the poet Blake. What does that mean? Eternity is in love with the productions of time. The source of temporal life is eternity. Eternity pours itself into the world. It is a basic mythic idea of the God who becomes many in us. In India, the God who lies in me is called the inhabitant of the body. To identify with that divine, immortal aspect of yourself is to identify yourself with divinity. Now, eternity is beyond all categories of thought, and this is an important point in all the great Oriental religions. We want to think about God. God is a thought. God is a name. God is an idea. But its reference is to something that transcends all thinking. The ultimate mystery of being is beyond all categories of thought. As Kant said, the thing in itself is no thing. It transcends thingness. It goes past anything that could be thought. The best things can't be told because they transcend thought. The second best are misunderstood because those are the thoughts that are supposed to refer to that which can't be thought about. The third best are what we talk about. And myth is that field of reference to what is absolutely transcendent. What can't be known or named except in our feeble attempt to clothe it in language? The ultimate word in our English language for that which is transcendent is God. But then you have a concept, don't you see? You think of God as the Father. Now, in religions where the God or Creator is the mother, the whole world is her body. There is nowhere else. The male God is usually somewhere else. But male and female are two aspects of one principle. The division of life into sexes was a late division. Biologically, the amoeba isn't male and female. The early cells are just cells. They divide and become two by asexual reproduction. I don't know at what level sexuality comes in, but it's late. And that's why it's absurd to speak of God as either this sex or that sex. But isn't the only way a human being can try to grope with this immense idea to assign it a language that he or she understands? God, he, God, she. Yes, but you don't understand it if you think it is a he or she. The he or she is a springboard to spring you into the transcendent, and transcendent means to transcend, to go past duality. Everything in the field of time and space is dual. The incarnation appears either as male or as female, and each of us in the incarnation of God. You're born in only one aspect of your actual metaphysical duality, you might say. And this is represented in the mystery religions, where an individual goes through a series of initiations, opening him inside into a deeper, deeper depth of himself. And there comes a moment when he realizes that he is both mortal and immortal, both male and female. Do you think there was such a place as the Garden of Eden? Of course not. The Garden of Eden is a metaphor for that innocence that is innocent of time, innocent of opposites, and that is the prime center out of which consciousness then becomes aware of the changes. But if there is, in the idea of Eden, this innocence, what happens to it? Isn't it shaken, dominated, and corrupted by fear? That's it. There is a wonderful story of the deity of the self that said, I am. As soon as it said, I am, it was afraid. Why? It was an entity now, in time. Then it thought, what should I be afraid of? I'm the only thing that is. And as soon as it said that, it felt lonesome, and it wished there was another, and so it felt desire. It swelled, split in two, became male and female, and begot the world. Fear is the first experience of the fetus in the womb. There's a Czechoslovakian psychiatrist, Stanislav Grof, now living in California, who for years treated people with LSD, and he found that some of them re-experienced birth, and in the re-experiencing of birth, the first stage is that of the fetus in the womb, without any sense of I or of being, and then shortly before birth, the rhythm of the uterus begins, and there's terror. Fear is the first thing. the thing that says I. Then comes the horrific stage of getting born, the difficult passage through the birth canal, and then, by God, light. Can you imagine? Isn't it amazing that this repeats just what the myth says? That self said, I am, and immediately felt fear. And then, when it realized it was alone, it felt desire for another and became two. That is the breaking into the world of light and the pairs of opposites. But what does it say about what all of us have in common that so many of these stories contain similar elements? The forbidden fruit, the woman. For example, these myths, these creation stories, contain a thou shalt not. Man and woman rebel against that prohibition and move out on their own. And after years and years of reading these things, I am still overwhelmed at the similarities in cultures that are far, far apart. There is a standard folktale motif called the one forbidden thing. Remember Bluebeard, who says to his wife, "Don't open that closet?" And then one always disobeys. In the Old Testament story, God points out the one forbidden thing. Now, God must have known very well that man was going to eat the forbidden fruit, but it was by doing that that man became the initiator of his own life. Life really began with that act of disobedience. But how do you explain these similarities? Well, there are two explanations. One explanation is that the human psyche is essentially the same all over the world. The psyche is the inward experience of the human body, which is essentially the same in all human beings, with the same organs, the same instincts, the same impulses, the same conflicts, the same fears. And out of this common ground have come what Jung has called the archetypes, which are the common ideas of myths. But what are the archetypes? They are elementary ideas, what could be called ground ideas. And these ideas Jung spoke of as archetypes of the unconscious. Archetype is the better term because elementary idea suggests headwork. Archetype of the unconscious means it comes from below. The difference between the Jungian archetypes of the unconscious and Freud's complexes is that the archetypes of the unconscious are manifestations of the organs of the body and their powers. Archetypes are biologically grounded, whereas the Freudian unconscious is a collection of repressed traumatic experiences from the individual's lifetime. The Freudian unconscious is a personal unconscious. It is biographical. The Jungian archetypes of the unconscious are biological. The biographical is second to that. All over the world, and at different times of human history, these archetypes or elementary ideas have appeared in different costumes. The differences in the costumes are the results of environment and historical conditions. It is these differences that the anthropologist is most concerned to identify and compare. Now, there's also a counter-theory of diffusion to account for the similarity of myths. For instance, the art of tilling the soil goes forth from the area in which it was first developed, and along with it goes a mythology that has to do with fertilizing the earth, with planting and bringing up the food plants. Some such myth as that, just described, of killing a deity, cutting it up, burying its members, and having the food plants grow. Such a myth will accompany an agricultural or planting tradition, but you won't find it in hunting culture. So there are historical as well as psychological aspects of this problem of the similarity of myths. Human beings subscribe to one or more of these stories of creation. What do you think we are looking for when we subscribe to one of these myths? I think what we are looking for is a way of experiencing the world that will open to us the transcendent, that informs us, and at the same time forms ourselves within it. And that is what people want. That is what the soul asks for. You mean we are looking for some accord with the mystery that informs all things, what you call that vast ground of silence which we all share? Yes, but not only to find it, but to find it actually in our environment, in our world, to recognize it, to have some kind of instruction that will enable us to experience the divine presence. The first storytellers. The animal envoys of the unseen power no longer serve, as in primeval times, to teach and to guide mankind. Bears, lions, elephants, ibexes, and gazelles are in cages in our zoos. Man is no longer the newcomer in a world of unexplored plains and forests, and our immediate neighbors are not wild beasts, but other human beings, contending for goods and space on a planet that is whirling without end around the fireball of a star. Neither in body nor in mind do we inhabit the world of those hunting races of the Paleolithic millennia, to whose lives and life ways we nevertheless owe the very forms of our bodies and structures of our minds. Memories of their animal envoys still must sleep somehow within us, for they wake a little and stir when we venture into wilderness. They wake in terror to thunder, and again they wake with a sense of recognition when we enter any one of those great painted caves. Whatever the inward darkness may have been to which the shamans of those caves descended in their trances, the same must lie within ourselves, nightly visited in sleep. Joseph Campbell, The Way of the Animal Powers. Do you think the poet Wordsworth was right when he wrote, "Our birth is but a sleep, and a forgetting, the soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar"? Do you think that is so? I do. Not an entire forgetfulness. That is to say, the nerves in our body carry the memories that shaped the organization of our nervous system to certain environmental circumstances and to the demands of an organism. What do our souls owe to ancient myths? The ancient myths were designed to harmonize the mind and the body. The mind can ramble off in strange ways and want things that the body does not want. The myths and rites were means of putting the mind in accord with the body, and the way of life in accord with the way that nature dictates. So these old stories live in us? They do indeed. The stages of human development are the same today as they were in the ancient times. As a child, you are brought up in a world of discipline, of obedience, and you are dependent on others. All this has to be transcended when you come to maturity so that you can live not in dependency but with self-responsible authority. If you can't cross that threshold, you have the basis for neurosis. And then comes the one after you have gained your world, of yielding it, the crisis of dismissal, disengagement. And ultimately death, That's the ultimate disengagement. So myth has to serve both aims, that of inducting the young person into the life of his world. That's the function of the folk idea. Then disengaging him. The folk idea unshells the elementary idea which guides you to your own inward life. And these myths tell me how others have made the passage and how I can make the passage. Yes, and also what are the beauties of the way. I feel this now, moving into my own last years. The myths help me to go with it. What kind of myths? Give me one that has actually helped you. The tradition in India, for instance, of actually changing your whole way of dress, even changing your name as you pass from one stage to another. When I retired from teaching, I knew that I had to create a new way of life, and I changed my manner of thinking about my life, just in terms of that notion, moving out of the sphere of achievement into the sphere of enjoyment and appreciation and relaxing to the wonder of it all. And then there's that final passage through the dark gate. Well, that is no problem at all. The problem in middle life, when the body has reached its climax of power and begins to decline, is to identify yourself not with the body, which is falling away, but with the consciousness of which it is a vehicle. And this is something I learned from myths. What am I? Am I the bulb that carries the light? Or am I the light of which the bulb is a vehicle? One of the psychological problems in growing old is the fear of death, and people resist the door of death. But this body is a vehicle of consciousness, and if you can identify with the consciousness, you can watch this body go like an old car. There goes the fender, there goes the tire, one thing after another, but it's predictable, And then, gradually, the whole thing drops off and consciousness rejoins consciousness. It is no longer in this particular environment. So these myths have something to say about growing old. I asked that because so many of the myths are of these beautiful youth. The Greek myths are. When we think about mythology, we usually think either of the Greek mythology or the biblical mythology. There's a kind of humanization of the myth material in both of these cultures. There's a very strong accent on the human and in the Greek myths, especially on the humanity and glory of the beautiful youth. But they appreciate age as well. You have the wise old man and the sage as respected characters in the Greek world. And the other cultures? Well, they don't stress the beauty of youth to that extent. You say that the image of death is the beginning of mythology. What do you mean? The earliest evidence of anything like mythological thinking is associated with graves, and they suggest that men and women saw life, and then they didn't see it, so they wondered about it. It must have been something like that. You only have to imagine what our own experience would be. The grave burials with their weapons and sacrifices to ensure a continued life. These certainly suggest that there was a person who was alive and warm before you, who is now lying there cold and beginning to rot. Something was there that isn't there. Where is it now? When do you think humans first discovered death? They first discovered death when they were first humans because they died. Now, animals have the experience of watching their companions dying, but as far as we know, they have no further thoughts about it, and there is no evidence that humans thought about death in a significant way until the Neanderthal period, when weapons and animal sacrifices occur with burials. What did these sacrifices represent? That I wouldn't know. Only a guess. I try not to guess. We have a tremendous amount of information about the subject, but there's a place where the information stops. And until you have writing, you don't know what people were thinking. All you have are significant remains of one kind or another, and you can extrapolate backward, but that's dangerous. However, we do know that burials always involve the idea of the continued life beyond the visible one, of a plane of being that is beyond the visible plane, and that is somehow supportive of the visible one to which we have to relate. I would say that that is the basic theme of all mythology, that there is an invisible plane supporting the visible one. What we don't know supports what we do know. Yes, and this idea of invisible support is connected with one's society, too. Society was there before you. It is there after you are gone, and you are a member of it. The myths that link you to your social group, the tribal myths, affirm that you are an organ of the larger organism. Society itself is an organ of a larger organism, which is the landscape, the world in which the tribe moves. The main theme in ritual is the linking of the individual to a larger morphological structure than that of his own physical body. Man lives by killing, and there is a sense of guilt connected with that. Burials suggest that my friend has died and he survives. The animals that I have killed must also survive. Early hunters usually had a kind of animal divinity. The technical name would be the animal master, the animal who is the master animal. The animal master sends the flocks to be killed. You see, the basic hunting myth is of a kind of covenant between the animal world and the human world. The animal gives its life willingly, with the understanding that its life transcends its physical entity and will be returned to the soil or to the mother through some ritual of restoration. And this ritual of restoration is associated with the main hunting animal. To the Indians of the American plains, it was the buffalo. On the northwest coast, the great festivals have to do with the run of salmon coming in. When you go to South Africa, the eland, the magnificent antelope, is the principal animal. And the principal animal is the one that furnishes the food. So in the early hunting societies that grew up between human beings and animals, a bonding that required one to be consumed by the other. That is the way life is. Man is a hunter, and hunter is a beast of prey. In the myths, the beast of prey and the animal who is preyed upon play two significant roles. They represent two aspects of life, the aggressive, killing, conquering, creating aspect of life, and the one that is the matter of, you might say, the subject matter, life itself. Power of Myth Part 3, Sacrifice and Bliss. If you follow your bliss, you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while, waiting for you. And the life that you ought to be living is the one you are living. Wherever you are, if you are following your bliss, you are enjoying that refreshment, that life within you, all the time. What impresses me as I read what you have written about the impact of the environment on storytelling is that these people, the people on the plains, the hunters, the people in the forest, the planters, are participating in their landscape. They are part of their world, and every feature of their world becomes sacred to them. The sanctification of the local landscape is a fundamental function of mythology. You can see this very clearly with the Navajo, who will identify a northern mountain, a southern mountain, an eastern mountain, a western mountain, and a central mountain. In a Navajo hogan, the door always faces east. The fireplace is in the center, which becomes a cosmic center, with the smoke coming up through the hole in the ceiling so that the scent of the incense goes to the nostrils of the gods. The landscape, the dwelling place, becomes an icon, a holy picture. Wherever you are, you're related to the cosmic order. Again, when you see a Navajo sand painting, there will be a surrounding figure, and it may represent a mirage or the rainbow or whatnot, but there will always be a surrounding figure with an opening in the east so that the new spirit can pour in. When the Buddha sat under the bo tree, he faced east, the direction of the rising sun. On my first visit to Kenya, I went alone to one of the ancient sites of a primitive camp on what used to be the shore of a lake, and stayed there until night fell, feeling a sense of the presence of all creation, sensing underneath that night sky and that vast place that I belonged to something ancient, something very much still alive. I think it's Cicero who says that when you go into a great tall grove, the presence of a deity becomes known to you. There are sacred groves everywhere. And going into the forest as a little boy, I can remember worshiping a tree, a great big old tree, thinking, my, what you've known and been. And I think this sense of the presence of creation is a basic mood of man. But we live now in a city. It's all stone and rock, manufactured by human hands. It's a different kind of world to grow up in when you're out in the forest with the little chipmunks and the great owls. All these things are around you as presences, representing forces and powers and magical possibilities of life that are not yours, and yet are all part of life, and that opens it out to you. Then you find it echoing in yourself because you are nature. When a Sioux Indian would take the calumet, the pipe, he would hold it up stem to the sky so that the sun could take the first puff, and then he'd address the four directions, always. In that frame of mind, when you're addressing yourself to the horizon, to the world that you're in, then you're in your place in the world. It's a different way to live. You write in the mythic image about the center of transformation, the idea of a sacred place where the temporal walls may dissolve to reveal a wonder. What does it mean to have a sacred place? This is an absolute necessity for anybody today. You must have a room or a certain hour or so a day where you don't know what was in the newspapers that morning. You don't know who your friends are. You don't know what you owe anybody. You don't know that, anybody owes you something. This is a place where you can simply experience and bring forth what you are and what you might be. And this is the place of creative incubation. At first you may find that nothing happens there, but if you have a sacred place and use it, something eventually will happen. This sacred place does for you what the plains did for the hunter. Well, for them, the whole world was a sacred place, but our life has become so economic and practical in its orientation that as you get older, the claims of the moment upon you are so great, you hardly know where the hell you are or what it is you intended. You are always doing something that is required of you. Where is your bliss station? You have to try to find it. Get a phonograph and put on the music that you really love, even if it's corny music that nobody else respects, or get the book you like to read. In your sacred place, you get the thou feeling of life that these people had for the whole world in which they lived. We have talked about the impact of the landscape on the people, but what about the effect of people on the landscape? People claim the land by creating sacred sites, by mythologizing the animals and plants. They invest the land with spiritual powers. It becomes like a temple, a place for meditation. For example, the Navajo did a marvelous job in mythologizing animals. In the Navajo sand paintings, you see these little animals, each with its own value. Now, these animals are not shown naturalistically, they are stylized. And the stylization refers to their spiritual, not to their merely physical characteristics. There's a big fly, for example, that will sometimes fly down and sit on your shoulder when you're walking along in the desert. In the Navajo myths, he is known as Big Fly, also as Little Wind, and he whispers to the young heroes the answers to all the questions that their fathers put to them when they're being tested. Big Fly is the voice of the Holy Spirit revealing hidden wisdom. And the purpose of all this? To claim the land, to turn the land where they lived into a place of spiritual relevance. So when Moses looked out on the promised land, he was simply doing what other spiritual leaders had done for their own people. He was claiming that land. Yes, you remember the story of Jacob's dream. When Jacob awakes, the place becomes Bethel, the house of God. Jacob has claimed that place with a certain spiritual significance, and this is the place where God sowed his energies. Do sacred sites still exist on the continent today? Mexico City was a sacred site, one of the great cities in the world before the Spanish tore it apart. When the Spanish first saw Mexico City, it was a greater city than any city in Europe, and it was a sacred city with great temples. Now, the Catholic cathedral is right where the Temple of the Sun used to be, and that's an example of land claiming by the Christians. You see, they are transforming the same landscape into their landscape by putting their temple where the other temple was. Our Pilgrim Fathers, for example, named sites after biblical centers, and somebody in Upper New York State had the Odyssey and Iliad in his mind. Ithaca, Utica, and one classical name after another. In a sense, people are anointing the land where they believe there is energy which empowers them. There is an organic relationship between the land and the structures people build upon it. Yes, but that ended with the coming of the metropolis. In New York now, the competition is over who can build the tallest building. This is a kind of architectural triumph. It is a statement of the city that we are a financial power center, and look what we can do. It is a kind of virtuoso acrobatic stunt. Where are the sacred places today? They don't exist. There are a few historical spots where people may go think about something important that happened there. For example, we may go visit the Holy Land, because that's the land of our religious origins. But every land should be a holy land. One should find the symbol in the landscape itself of the energies of the life there. And that's what all early traditions do. They sanctify their own landscape. That's what the early settlers of Iceland did, for example, in the 8th and 9th centuries. They established their different settlements in a relationship of 432,000 Roman feet to each other. The whole organization of the Icelandic landscape was in terms of such cosmic relationships, so that wherever you go in Iceland, you are, so to say, if you know your mythology, in accord with the universe. And this is the same kind of mythology that you have in Egypt. But in Egypt, the symbology took a different shape because Egypt is not circular. Egypt is long. So there you have the sky goddess as a sacred cow, 2 feet in the south and 2 feet in the north, a rectangular idea, so to speak. But the spiritual symbolization of our own civilization is basically lost to us, and that's why it's so wonderful to go to the lovely little French town of Chartres, where the cathedral still dominates, and you hear the bells ring when night turns to day, and when morning turns to noon, and again when day turns to night. The hero's adventure. Furthermore, we have not even to risk the adventure alone, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path, and where we had thought to find an abomination, we shall find a god. And where we had thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outward, we will come to the center of our own existence, and where we had thought to be alone, we will be with all the world. Why are there so many stories of the hero in mythology? Because that's what's worth writing about. Even in popular novels, the main character is a hero or heroine who has found or done something beyond the normal range of achievement and experience. A hero is someone who has given his or her life to something bigger than oneself. So in all of these cultures, whatever the local costume the hero might be wearing, what is the deed? Well, there are 2 types of deed. One is the physical deed, in which the hero performs a courageous act in battle or saves a life. The other is a spiritual deed, in which the hero learns to experience the supernormal range of human spiritual life, and then comes back with a message. The usual hero adventure begins with someone from whom something has been taken, or who feels there's something lacking in the normal experiences available or permitted to the members of his society. This person then takes off on a series of adventures beyond the ordinary, either to recover what has been lost. It's usually a cycle, a going and a returning. But the structure and something of the spiritual sense of this adventure can be seen already anticipated in the puberty or initiation rituals of early tribal societies, through which a child is compelled to give up its childhood and become an adult, to die, you might say, to its infantile personality and psyche, and come back as a responsible adult. This is a fundamental psychological transformation that everyone has to undergo. We are in childhood in a condition of dependency under someone's protection and supervision for some 14 to 21 years. And if you're going on for your PhD, this may continue to perhaps 35. You're in no way a self-responsible free agent, but an obedient dependent, expecting and receiving punishments and rewards. To evolve out of this position of psychological immaturity to the courage of self-responsibility and assurance requires a death and a resurrection, leaving one condition and finding the source of life to bring you forth into a richer or mature condition. So even if we happen not to be heroes in the grand sense of redeeming society, we still have to take that journey inside ourselves, spiritually and psychologically. That's right. Otto Rank, in his important little book, The Myth of the Birth of the Hero, declares that everyone is a hero in birth, where he undergoes a tremendous psychological as well as physical transformation from the condition of a little water creature living in a realm of amniotic fluid into an air-breathing mammal which ultimately will be standing. That's an enormous transformation, and had it been consciously undertaken, it would have been indeed a heroic act. And there was a heroic act on the mother's part as well, who had brought this all about. Then heroes are not all men? Oh no, the male usually has the more conspicuous role, just because of the conditions of life. He is out there in the world, and the woman is in the home. But among the Aztecs, for example, who had a number of heavens to which people's souls would be assigned according to the conditions of their death, the heaven for warriors killed in battle was the same for mothers who died in childbirth. Giving birth is definitely a heroic deed, in that it is the giving over of oneself to the life of another. But don't you think we've lost that truth in this society of ours where it's deemed more heroic to go out into the world and make a lot of money than it is to raise children? Well, making money gets more advertisement. You know the old saying, if a dog bites a man, that's not a story. But if a man bites a dog, you've got a story there. So the thing that happens and happens and happens, no matter how heroic it may be, is not news. Motherhood has lost its novelty, you might say. Well, that's a wonderful image, though, the mother as hero. Well, it's always seemed so to me. That's something I learned from reading these myths. It's a journey. You have to move out of the known, conventional safety of your life to undertake this. Well, you have to be transformed from a maiden to a mother, and that's a big change, involving many dangers. And when you come back from your journey with the child, you've brought something for the world. And when you come back from your journey with the child, you've brought something for the world. Well, not only that, you've got a life job ahead of you. Otto Rank makes the point that there is a world of people who think that their heroic act in being born qualifies them for the respect and support of their whole community. But there's still a journey to be taken after that. There's a large journey to be taken of many trials. What's the significance of the trials and tests and ordeals of the hero? If you want to put it in terms of intentions, the trials are designed to see to it that the intending hero should be really a hero. Is he really a match for this task? Can he overcome the dangers? Does he have the courage, the knowledge, the capacity to enable him to serve? In this culture of easy religion, cheaply achieved, it seems to me we've forgotten that all three of the great religions teach that the trials of the hero journey are a significant part of life, that there's no reward without renunciation, without paying the price. The Quran says, "Do you think that you shall enter the garden of bliss without such trials as came to those who passed before you?" And Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew, "Great is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth to life, and few there be who find it." And the heroes of the Jewish tradition undergo great tests before they arrive at their redemption. Well, if you realize what the real problem is, losing yourself, giving yourself to some higher end or to another, you realize that this itself is the ultimate trial. When we quit thinking primarily about ourselves and our own self-preservation, we undergo a truly heroic transformation of consciousness. And what all the myths have to deal with is transformation of consciousness of one kind or another. You've been thinking one way, but now you have to think in a different way. How is consciousness transformed? Either by the trials themselves or by illuminating revelations. Trials and revelations are what it's all about. Isn't there a moment of redemption in all of these stories? The woman is saved from the dragon, the city is spared from obliteration, the hero is snatched from danger in the nick of time. Well, yes, there would be no hero deed unless there were an achievement. We can have the hero who fails, but he's usually represented as a kind of clown, someone pretending to more than he can achieve. But how is a hero different from a leader? Well, that is a problem Tolstoy dealt with in War and Peace. Here you have Napoleon ravaging Europe and now about to invade Russia, and Tolstoy raises this question: is the leader really a leader, or is he simply the one out in front on a wave? In psychological terms, the leader might be analyzed as the one who perceived what could be achieved and did it. It has been said that a leader is someone who discerned the inevitable and got in front of it. Napoleon was a leader, but he wasn't a hero in the sense that what he accomplished was grand for humanity's sake. It was for France, the glory of France. Then he is a French hero, is he not? This is the problem for today. Is the hero of a given state or people what we need today when the whole planet should be our field of concern? Napoleon is the 19th century counterpart of Hitler in the 20th. Napoleon's ravaging of Europe was horrific. So you could be a local god and fail the test on a larger cosmic level? Yes, or you could be a local god, but for the people whom that local god conquered, you could be the enemy. Whether you call someone a hero or a monster is all relative to where the focus of your consciousness may be. So we have to be careful not to call a deed heroic when, in a larger mythological sense, it simply doesn't work that way. Well, I don't know. The deed could be absolutely a heroic deed. A person giving his life for his own people, for example. Ah, yes, the German soldier who dies is as much a hero as the American who was sent over there to kill him. So does heroism have a moral objective? The moral objective is that of saving a people, or saving a person, or supporting an idea. The hero sacrifices himself for something. That's the morality of it. Now, from another position, of course, you might say that the idea for which he sacrificed himself was something that should not have been respected. And that's a judgment from the other side. But it doesn't destroy the intrinsic heroism of the deed performed. That's a different angle on heroes from what I got as a young boy when I read the story of Prometheus going after fire and bringing it back, benefiting humanity and suffering for it. Yes, Prometheus brings fire to mankind and consequently civilization. The fire theft, by the way, is a universal mythic theme. Often it's a trickster animal or bird that steals the fire and then passes it along to a relay team of birds or animals who run with it. Sometimes the animals are burned by the flames as they pass the fire along, and this is said to account for their different colorings. The fire theft is a very popular worldwide story. The people in each culture are trying to explain where fire came from. The story isn't really trying to explain it. It has to do more with the value of fire. The fire theft sets man apart from the animals. When you're in the woods at night, you light a fire, and that keeps the animals away. You can see their eyes shining, but they're outside the fire range. So they're not telling the story just to inspire others or to make a moral point. No, it's to evaluate the fire, its importance to us, and to say something about what has set man apart from the beasts. Does your study of mythology lead you to conclude that a single human quest, a standard pattern of human aspiration and thought, constitutes for all mankind something that we have in common, whether we lived 1,000,000 years ago or will live 1,000 years from now? Well, there's a certain type of myth which one might call the vision quest, going in quest of a boon, a vision, which is the same form in every mythology. And that is the thing that I tried to present in the first book I wrote, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. All these different mythologies give us the same essential quest. You leave the world that you're in and you go into a depth or into a distance or up to a height. And there you come to what was missing in your consciousness in the world you formerly inhabited. And then comes the problem either of staying with that and letting the world drop off, or returning with that boon and trying to hold on to it as you move back into your social world again, or returning with that boon and trying to hold on to it as you move back into your social world again. That's not an easy thing to do. So the hero goes for something. He doesn't just go along for the ride. He's not simply an adventurer. Well, there are both kinds of heroes, some that choose to undertake the journey and some that don't. In one kind of adventure, the hero sets out responsibly and intentionally to perform the deed. For instance, Odysseus' son Telemachus was told by Athena, "Go find your father." And that father quest is a major hero adventure for young people. That is the adventure of finding what your career is, what your nature is, what your source is. You undertake that intentionally. Or there's the legend of the Sumerian sky goddess Inanna, who descended into the underworld and underwent death to bring her beloved back to life. Then there are the adventures into which you are thrown, for example, being drafted into the army. You didn't intend it, but you're in now. You've undergone a death and resurrection. You've put on a uniform and you're another creature. One kind of hero that often appears in Celtic myths is the princely hunter who has followed the lure of a deer into a range of forest that he has never seen or been in before. The animal there undergoes a transformation, becoming the queen of the fairy hills or something of that kind. And this is a type of adventure in which the hero has no idea what he's doing, but suddenly finds himself in a transformed realm. Is the adventurer who takes that kind of a trip a hero in the mythological sense? Yes, because he's always ready for it. In these stories, the adventure that the hero is ready for is the one he gets. The adventure is symbolically a manifestation of his character. Even the landscape and the conditions of the environment match his readiness. In George Lucas's Star Wars, Solo begins as a mercenary and ends up a hero, coming in at the last to save Luke Skywalker. Yes, there, Solo has done the hero act of sacrificing himself for another. Do you think that a hero is created out of guilt? Was Solo guilty because he had abandoned Skywalker? It depends on what system of ideas you want to apply. Solo was a practical guy, at least as he thought of himself, a materialist. But he was a compassionate human being at the same time and didn't know it. The adventure evoked a quality of his character that he hadn't known he possessed. So perhaps the hero lurks in each one of us when we don't know it. Our life evokes our character. You find out more about yourself as you go on, and that's why it's good to be able to put yourself in situations that will evoke your higher nature rather than your lower. Lead us not into temptation. Ortega y Gasset talks about the environment and the hero in his meditations on Don Quixote. Don Quixote was the last hero of the Middle Ages. He rode out to encounter giants, but instead of giants, his environment produced windmills. Ortega points out that this story takes place about the time that a mechanistic interpretation of the world came in, so that the environment was no longer spiritually responsive to the hero. The hero is today running up against a hard world that is in no way responsive to his spiritual need. The gift of the goddess. Myths of the great goddess teach compassion for all living beings. There you come to appreciate the real sanctity of the earth itself, because it is the body of the goddess. The Lord's Prayer begins, "Our Father, which art in heaven," could it have begun, "Our Mother"? Well, this is a symbolic image. All of the references of religious and mythological images are to planes of consciousness or fields of experience that are potential in human spirit. And these images evoke attitudes and experiences that are appropriate to a meditation on the mystery of the source of your own being. There have been systems of religion where the mother is the prime parent, the source. The mother is really a more immediate parent than the father, because one is born from the mother, and the first experience of any infant is the mother. I have frequently thought that mythology is a sublimation of the mother image. We talk of Mother Earth, and in Egypt you have the Mother Heavens, the goddess Nut, who is represented as the whole heavenly sphere. I was seized in Egypt upon first seeing the figure of Nut in the ceiling of one of those temples. Yes, I know the temple. It's overwhelming in both its ability to evoke awe and in its sensual character. Yes, the idea of the goddess is related to the fact that you are born from your mother, and your father may be unknown to you, or the father may have died. Frequently in the epics, when the hero is born, his father has died, or his father is in some other place, and then the hero has to go in quest of his father. In the story of the incarnation of Jesus, the father of Jesus was the Father in heaven, at least in terms of the symbology. When Jesus goes to the cross, he's on the way to the Father, leaving the mother behind. And the cross, which is symbolic of the earth, is the mother symbol. So on the cross, Jesus leaves his body on the mother, from whom he has acquired his body, and he goes to the Father, who is the ultimate transcendent mystery source. What impact has this Father quest had on us down through the centuries? It's a major theme in myth, where the boy says, "Mother, who is my father?" And she will say, "Well, your father is in such and such a place," and then he goes on the father quest. Well, in the Odyssey, Odysseus' son Telemachus is a tiny babe when Odysseus goes off to the Trojan War. The war lasts for 10 years, and then on his journey home, Odysseus is lost for 10 more years in the mysterious world of the mythological Mediterranean. Athena comes to Telemachus, who is now 20 years old, and says, "Go find your father." Well, he doesn't know where his father is. He goes to Nestor and asks, "Where do you think my father would be?" And Nestor says, "Well, go ask Proteus. He's on the father quest." In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker says to his companions, "I wish I had known my father." There's something powerful in the image of the father quest. But why no mother quest? Well, the mother's right there. You're born from your mother, and she's the one who nurses you and instructs you and brings you up to the age when you must find your father. Now, the finding of the father has to do with finding your own character and destiny. There's a notion that the character is inherited from the father, and the body, and very often the mind, from the mother. But it's your character that's the mystery, and your character is your destiny. So it is the discovery of your destiny that is symbolized by the father quest. So when you found your father, you found yourself. We have the word in English, atonement, at one meant with the Father. You remember the story of Jesus lost in Jerusalem when he's a little boy, about 12 years old. His parents hunt for him, and when they find him in the temple, in conversation with the doctors of the law, they ask, "Why did you abandon us this way? Why did you give us this fear and anxiety?" And he says, "Didn't you know I had to be about my Father's business?" He's 12 years old. That's the age of the adolescent initiations. Finding who you are. But what happened along the way to this reverence that in primitive societies was directed towards the goddess figure, the great goddess, the Mother Earth? What happened to that? Well, that was associated primarily with agriculture and the agricultural societies. It has to do with earth. The human woman gives birth just as the earth gives birth to the plants. She gives nourishment as the plants do. So woman magic and earth magic are the same. They are related. And the personification of the energy that gives birth to forms and nourishes forms is properly female. It is in the agricultural world of ancient Mesopotamia, the Egyptian Nile, and in the earlier planting culture systems, that the goddess is the dominant mythic form. We have found hundreds of early Neolithic figurines of the goddess, but hardly anything there of the male figure at all. The bull and certain other animals, such as the boar and the goat, may appear as symbolic of the male power, but the goddess was the only visualized divinity at that time. And when you have a goddess as the creator, it's her own body that is the universe. She is identical with the universe. And that's the sense of that goddess nut figure that you saw in the Egyptian temple. She is the whole sphere of the life-enclosing heavens. There is one scene of the goddess swallowing the sun, remember? The idea is that she swallows the sun in the west and gives birth to the sun in the east, and it passes through her body at night. So it would be natural for people trying to explain the wonders of the universe to look to the female figure as the explanation of what they see in their own lives. Not only that, but when you move to a philosophical point of view, as in the goddess religions of India, where the goddess symbology is dominant to this day, the female represents Maya. The female represents what in Kantian terminology we call the forms of sensibility. She is time and space itself, and the mystery beyond her is beyond all pairs of opposites. So it isn't male and it isn't female. It neither is nor is not, but everything is within her, so that the gods are her children. Everything you can think of, everything you can see is a production of the goddess. I once saw a marvelous scientific movie about protoplasm. It was a revelation to me. It is in movement all the time, flowing. Sometimes it seems to be flowing this way and that, and then it shapes things. It has a potentiality for bringing things into shape. And I saw this movie in Northern California, and as I drove down the coast to Big Sur all the way, all I could see was protoplasm in the form of grass being eaten by protoplasm, in the form of cows, protoplasm in the form of birds, diving for protoplasm in the form of fish. So you just got this wonderful sense of the abyss from which all has come. But each form has its own intentions, its own possibilities, and that's where meaning comes, not in the protoplasm itself. We are right back then to the Indians, who believe that the informing life and energy of all things is the earth. You quote those lines from the Upanishads. Thou art the dark blue bird and the green parrot with red eyes. Thou hast the lightning as thy child. Thou art the season and the seas, having no beginning. Thou dost abide with the immanence, whereof all things are born. That's the idea, isn't it, that we and the earth are the same? But wasn't it inevitable that this idea would die under the weight of scientific discoveries? I mean, we know now that plants don't grow out of the bodies of dead people. They grow according to the laws of seed and soil and sun. Didn't Newton kill myth? Oh, I think myth is coming back. There's a young scientist today who's using the term morphogenetic field, the field that produces forms. That's who the goddess is, the field that produces forms. What's the significance for us? Well, it means to find what is the source of your own life. What is the relationship of your body, your physical form, to this energy that animates it? The body without the energy isn't alive, is it? So you distinguish in your own life that which is of the body and that which is of energy and consciousness. In India, the most common ultimate symbol is of the phallus, or lingam, as they call it, of the generating god penetrating the vagina, or the yoni, as they call it, of the goddess. In contemplating this symbol, you are contemplating the generating moment itself of all life. The entire mystery of the generation of life is symbolically contemplated in that sign. You see, the sexual mystery in India and in most of the world is a holy mystery. It is the mystery of the generation of life. The act of generating a child is a cosmic act and is to be understood as holy. And so the symbol that most immediately represents this mystery of the pouring of the energy of life into the field of time is the lingam and the yoni, the male and female powers in creative conjunction. Tales of love and marriage. Love is such a vast subject that, well, if I came to you and said, let's talk about love, where would you begin? I'd begin with the troubadours in the 12th century. And who were they? The troubadours were the nobility of Provence and then later other parts of France and Europe. In Germany, they're known as the Minnesingers, the singers of love. Minne is the medieval German word for love. Were they the poets of their age? Well, they were poets of a certain character, yes. The period for the troubadours is the 12th century. The whole troubadour tradition was extinguished in Provence in the so-called Albigensian Crusade of 1209, which was launched by Pope Innocent III, and which is regarded as one of the most monstrous crusades in the history of Europe. The troubadours became associated with the Manichaean heresy of the Albigensians that was rampant at that time, though the Albigensian movement was really a protest against the corruption of the medieval clergy. So the troubadours and their transformation of the idea of love got mixed up in religious life in a very complicated way. The transformation of love, what do you mean? The troubadours were very much interested in the psychology of love, and they're the first ones in the West who really thought of love the way we do now, as a person-to-person relationship. What had it been before that? Before that, love was simply eros, the god who excites you to sexual desire. And this is not the experience of falling in love the way the troubadours understood it. Eros is much more impersonal than falling in love. You see, people didn't know about amor. Amor is something personal that the troubadours recognized. Eros and agape are impersonal loves. Explain. Eros is a biological urge. It's the zeal of the organs for each other. The personal factor doesn't matter. And agape? Agape is love thy neighbor as thyself, spiritual love. It doesn't matter who the neighbor is. Now, this is not passion in the sense that Eros mandates it. This is compassion, I would think. Yes, it is compassion. It's the heart opening. But it is not individual as amor is. Yes, it's compassion. It is a heart opening. But it is not individuated as amor is. Agape is a religious impulse. Yes, but amor could become a religious impulse too. The troubadours recognized amor as the highest spiritual experience. You see, the experience of eros is a kind of seizure. In India, the god of love is a big, vigorous youth with a bow and a quiver of arrows. The names of the arrows are death-bringing agony and open up and so forth. Really, he just drives this thing into you so that it's a total physiological, psychological explosion. Then the other love, agape, is a love of the neighbor as thyself. Again, it doesn't matter who the person is, it's your neighbor, and you must have that kind of love. But with amor, we have a purely personal ideal, the kind of seizure that comes from the meeting of the eyes, as they say in the troubadour tradition, is a person-to-person experience. There's a poem in one of your books about this meeting of the eyes. So through the eyes, love attains the heart. That's completely contrary to everything the church stood for. It's a personal, individual experience, and I think it's the essential thing that's great about the West and that makes it different from all other traditions I know. So the courage to love became the courage to affirm one's own experience against tradition, the tradition of the church. Why was that important in the evolution of the West? It was important in that it gave the West this accent on the individual, that one should have faith in his experience and not simply mouth terms handed down to him by others. It stresses the validity of the individual's experience of what humanity is, what life is, what values are against the monolithic system. The monolithic system is a machine system. Every machine works like every other machine that's come out of the same shop. What did you mean when you wrote that the beginning of romantic love in the West was libido over credo? Well, the credo says, I believe, and I believe not only in the laws, but I believe that these laws were instituted by God, and there's no arguing with God. These laws are a heavy weight on me, and disobeying these is sin, and has to do with my eternal character. That's the credo. That's the credo. You believe, and then you go to confession, and you run down through the list of sins, and you count yourself against those. And instead of going into the priest and saying, bless me, Father, for I have been great this week, you meditate on the sins. And in meditating on the sins, then you really become a sinner in your life. It's a condemnation, actually, of the will to life. That's what the credo is. And libido? The libido is the impulse to life. It comes from the heart. And the heart is the organ of opening up to somebody else. That's the human quality as opposed to the animal qualities, which have to do with self-interest. So you're talking about romantic love as opposed to lust or passion or a general religious sentiment. Yes, the usual marriage in traditional cultures was arranged for by the families. It wasn't a person-to-person decision at all. In India to this day, you have columns in the newspapers of advertisements for wives that are put in by marriage brokers. I remember in one family that I knew there, the daughter was going to marry. She had never seen the young man she was going to marry, and she would ask her brothers, is he tall? Is he dark? Is he light? What? In the Middle Ages, that was the kind of marriage that was sanctified by the church, and so the troubadour idea of a real person-to-person amour was very dangerous because it was heresy. Not only heresy, it was adultery, what might be called spiritual adultery. Since the marriages were all arranged by society, the love that came from the meeting of the eyes was of a higher spiritual value. The true marriage is the marriage that springs from the recognition of identity in the other, and the physical union is simply the sacrament in which that is confirmed. It doesn't start the other way around, with the physical interest that then becomes spiritualized. It starts from the spiritual impact of love, amor. Christ spoke of the adulterer at heart, the violation of the union that takes place spiritually in the mind and heart. And every marriage was such a violation when it was arranged by society and not the heart. That's the sense of courtly love in the Middle Ages. It is in direct contradiction to the way of the church. The word amor, spelt backwards, is Roma, the Roman Catholic Church, which was justifying marriages that were simply political and social in their character, and so came this movement validating individual choice, what I call following your bliss. But there's danger too, of course, that one should feel the sickness of love. There's no possible fulfillment in this world of that identity one is experiencing. Now that's big stuff. Especially for medieval Catholics, who believed in a literal hell. And this is the affirmation of the pain of life in a big way, that nobody can frighten me off from this thing. And no matter what happens, this is the validation of my life and action. And in choosing love too, You wrote once that the point about hell as about heaven is that when you're there, you're in your proper place, which is finally where you want to be. That was Bernard Shaw's idea, and really Dante's idea also. The punishment in hell is that you have for eternity that which you thought you wanted on earth. But then William Blake says in his wonderful series of aphorisms, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, as I was walking among the fires of hell, which to angels look like torment, that is to say, for the people who are there, who are not angels, it's not the fire of pain, it's the fire of delight. I remember in Dante's Inferno, as Dante is looking on the great lovers of history in hell, he sees Helen, and he sees Cleopatra, and he sees Tristan. What's the significance of that? Dante is taking the church's attitude that this is hell and that they're suffering there. Remember, he sees the two young lovers from the Italy of his day, Paolo and Francesca. Francesca had a love affair with Paolo, the brother of her husband. And Dante, like a social scientist, says, darling, how did this happen? What brought this about? And then come the most famous lines in Dante. Francesca says that Paolo and she were sitting under a tree in the garden, reading the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. And when we read of their first kiss, we looked at each other and read no more in the book that day, and that was the beginning of their fall. That this wonderful experience should be condemned as a sin is the thing the troubadour just says no to. Love is the meaning of life. It is the high point of life. Power of Myth, Part 4. Masks of Eternity. The images of myth are reflections of the spiritual potentialities of every one of us. Through contemplating these, we evoke their powers in our lives. As you've moved along various worldviews, dipping in and out of cultures, civilizations, and religions, have you found something in common in every culture that creates the need for God? Anyone who's had an experience of mystery knows that there is a dimension of the universe that is not that which is available to his senses. There is a pertinent saying in one of the Upanishads, when before the beauty of a sunset or of a mountain you pause and exclaim, "Ah," you are participating in divinity. Such a moment of participation involves a realization of the wonder and sheer beauty of existence. People living in the world of nature experience such moments every day. They live in the recognition of something there that is much greater than the human dimension. Man's tendency, however, is to personify such experiences. Our way of thinking in the West sees God as the final source or cause of the energies and wonder of the universe. But in most Oriental thinking, and in primal thinking also, the gods are rather manifestations and purveyors of an energy that is finally impersonal. They are not its source. The god is the vehicle of its energy, and the force or quality of the energy that is involved or represented determines the character and function of the god. There are gods of violence, there are gods of compassion, there are gods that unite the two worlds of the unseen and the seen, and there are gods that are simply the protectors of kings or nations in their war campaigns. These are all personifications of the energies in play, but the ultimate source of the energies remains a mystery. Doesn't this make fate a kind of anarchy, a continuing war among principalities? Yes, as it is in life itself, even in our minds. When it comes to making a decision, there will be a war. In acting in relationship to other people, for example, there may be 4 or 5 possibilities. The influence of the dominant divinity in my mind will be what determines my decision. If my guiding divinity is brutal, my decision will be brutal as well. What does that do to faith? You are a man of faith, of wonder, and no, I don't have to have faith. I have experience. What kind of experience? I have experience of the wonder of life. I have experience of love. I have experience of hatred, malice, and wanting to punch this guy in the jaw. From the point of view of symbolic imaging, those are different forces operating in my mind. One may think of them, wonder, love, hatred, as inspired by different divinities. When I was a little boy being brought up as a Roman Catholic, I was told that I had a guardian angel on my right side and a tempting devil on my left, and that the decisions I made in life would depend on whether the devil or the angel had the greater influence upon me. As a boy, I concretized these thoughts, and I think my teachers did too. We thought there was really an angel there, and that the angel was a fact, and that the devil was also a fact. But instead of regarding them as facts, I can now think of them as metaphors for the impulses that move and guide me. Where do these energies come from? From your own life, from the energies of your own body. The different organs in the body, including your head, are in conflict with each other. And your life comes from where? From the ultimate energy that is the life of the universe. And then do you say, well, there must be somebody generating that energy. Why do you have to say that? Why can't the ultimate mystery be impersonal? Can men and women live with an impersonality? Yes, they do all over the place. Just go east of Suez. You know there is this tendency in the West to anthropomorphize and accent the humanity of the gods, the personifications. Yahweh, for example, as either a god of wrath, of justice and punishment, or as a favoring God who is the support of your life, as we read, for example, in the Psalms. But in the East, the gods are much more elemental, much less human, and much more like the powers of nature. When someone says, imagine God, the child in our culture will say, an old man in a long white robe with a beard. Well, in our culture, yes, it's our fashion to think of God in masculine form, but many traditions think of divine power principally in female form. The idea is that you cannot imagine what you cannot personify. Do you think it's possible to center the mind on what Plato called thoughts immortal and divine? Of course, that's what a meditation is. Meditation means constantly thinking on a certain theme. It can be on any level. I don't make a big split in my thinking between the physical and the spiritual. For example, meditation on money is a perfectly good meditation, and bringing up a family is a very important meditation. But there is an alone meditation when you go into the cathedral, for example. So prayer is actually a meditation. Prayer is relating to and meditating on a mystery, calling a power from within. There is a form of meditation you are taught in the Roman Catholicism where you recite the rosary, the same prayer, over and over and over again. That pulls the mind in. In Sanskrit, this practice is called japa, repetition of the holy name. It blocks other interests out and allows you to concentrate on the one thing, and then, depending on your own powers of imagination, to experience the profundity of this mystery. How does one have a profound experience? By having a profound sense of the mystery. But if God is the God we have only imagined, how can we stand in awe of our own creation? How can we be terrified by a dream? You have to break past your image of God to get through to the connoted illumination. The psychologist Jung has a relevant saying, religion is a defense against the experience of God. The mystery has been reduced to a set of concepts and ideas, and emphasizing these concepts and ideas can short-circuit the transcendent connoted experience. An intense experience of mystery is what one has to regard as the ultimate religious experience. There are many Christians who believe that to find out who Jesus is, you have to go past the Christian faith, past the Christian doctrine, past the Christian church. You have to go past the imagined image of Jesus. Such an image of one's God becomes a final obstruction, one's ultimate barrier. You hold on to your own ideology, your own little manner of thinking. And when a larger experience of God approaches, an experience greater than you are prepared to receive, you take flight from it by clinging to the image in your mind. This is known as preserving your faith. You know the idea of the ascent of the Spirit through the different centers or archetypal stages of experience. One begins with the elementary animal experiences of hunger and greed, and then of sexual zeal, and onto physical mastery of one kind or another. These are all empowering stages of experience. But then, when the center of the heart is touched, and a sense of compassion awakened with another person or creature, and you realize that you and that other are in some sense creatures of the one life in being, a whole new stage of life in the Spirit opens out. This opening of the heart to the world is what is symbolized mythologically as the virgin birth. It signifies the birth of a spiritual life in what was formerly an elementary human animal living for the merely physical aims of health, progeny, power, and a little fun. But now we come to something else. For to experience the sense of compassion, accord, or even identity with another or with some ego-transcending principle that has become lodged in your mind as a good to be revered and served, is the beginning, once and for all, of the properly religious way of life and experience. And this may then lead to a life-consuming quest for a full experience of that one being of beings, of which all temporal forms are the reflections. Now, this ultimate ground of all being can be experienced in two senses. One, as with form, and the other, as without and beyond form. When you experience your God as with form, there is your envisioning mind, and there is the God. There is a subject, and there is an object. But the ultimate mystical goal is to be united with one's God. With that, duality is transcended and forms disappear. There is nobody there, no God, no you. Your mind, going past all concepts, has dissolved in identification with the ground of your own being, because that to which the metaphorical image of your God refers is the ultimate mystery of your own being, which is the mystery of the being of the world as well. And so this is it. Of course, the heart of the Christian faith is that God was in Christ, that these elemental forces you're talking about embodied themselves in a human being who reconciled mankind to God. Yes, and the basic Gnostic and Buddhist idea is that this is true of you and me as well. Jesus was a historical person who realized in himself that he and what he called the Father were one, and he lived out of that knowledge of the Christhood of his nature. I remember I was once giving a lecture in which I spoke about living out of the sense of the Christ in you, and a priest in the audience, as I was later told, turned to the woman beside him and whispered, "That's blasphemy." "What did you mean by Christ in you?" What I meant was that you must live not in terms of your own ego system, not your own desires, but in terms of what you might call the sense of mankind, the Christ in you. There's a Hindu saying, none but a god can worship a god. You have to identify yourself in some measure with whatever spiritual principle your God represents to you in order to worship him properly and live according to his word. In discussing the God within, the Christ within, the illumination or the awakening that comes within, isn't there a danger of becoming narcissistic, of an obsession with self that leads to a distorted view of oneself and the world? That can happen, of course. That's a kind of short-circuiting of the current. But the whole aim is to go past oneself, past one's concept of oneself, to that of which one is but an imperfect manifestation. When you come out of a meditation, for example, you are supposed to end by yielding all the benefits, whatever they may be, to the world, to all living beings, not holding them to yourself. You see, there are two ways of thinking I am God. If you think I, here in my physical presence and in my temporal character, am God, then you are mad and have short-circuited the experience. You are God not in your ego, but in your deepest being, where you are at one with the non-dual transcendent. And somewhere you say that we can become savior figures to those in our circle, our children, our wives, our loved ones, our neighbors, but never the savior. You say we can be mother and father, but never the mother and the father. That's a recognition of limitation, isn't it? Yes, it is. What do you think about the Savior Jesus? We just don't know very much about Jesus. All we know are 4 contradictory texts that purport to tell us what he said and did, written many years after he lived. Yes, but in spite of this, I think we may know approximately what Jesus said. I think the sayings of Jesus are probably pretty close to the originals. The main teaching of Christ, for example, is love your enemies. Now, how do you love your enemy without condoning what the enemy does, without accepting his aggression? I'll tell you how to do that. Do not pluck the mote from your enemy's eyes, but pluck the beam from your own. No one is in a position to disqualify his enemy's way of life. Do you think Jesus today would be a Christian? Not the kind of Christian we know. Perhaps some of the monks and nuns who are really in touch with high spiritual mysteries would be of the sort that Jesus was. So Jesus might not have belonged to the church militant. There's nothing militant about Jesus. I don't read anything like that in any of the Gospels. Peter drew his sword and cut off the servant's ear, and Jesus said, "Put back thy sword, Peter." But Peter has had his sword out and at work ever since. I've lived through the 20th century, and I know what I was told as a boy about people who weren't yet and never had been our enemies. In order to represent them as potential enemies and to justify our attack upon them, a campaign of hatred, misrepresentation, and denigration was launched, of which the echoes ring to this day. And yet we're told God is love. You once took the saying of Jesus, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be the sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust." You once took this to be the highest, the noblest, the boldest of the Christian teachings. Do you still feel that way? I think of compassion as the fundamental religious experience, and unless that is there, you have nothing. I'll tell you what the most gripping scripture in the Christian New Testament is for me. I believe, help thou my unbelief. I believe in this ultimate reality that I can and do experience it. But I don't have answers to my questions. I believe in the question, is there a God? A couple of years ago, I had a very amusing experience. I was in the New York Athletic Club swimming pool, where I was introduced to a priest who was a professor at one of our Catholic universities. So after I had had my swim, I came and sat in a lounging chair in what we call the horizontal athlete position. And the priest, who was beside me, asked, "Now, Mr. Campbell, are you a priest?" I answered, "No, Father." He asked, "Are you Catholic?" I answered, "I was, Father." Then he asked, and I think that's interesting that he phrased the question in this way, "Do you believe in a personal God?" "No, Father," I said. And he replied, "Well, I suppose there's no way to prove by logic the existence of a personal God." "If there were, Father," said I, "what then would be the value of faith?" "Well, Mr. Campbell," said the priest quickly, "it's nice to have met you," and he was off. I felt I had executed a jiu-jitsu throw. But that was an illuminating conversation to me. The fact that a Catholic father had asked, "Do you believe in a personal God?" meant to me that he had also recognized the possibility of an impersonal God, namely a transcendent ground or energy in itself. The idea of Buddha consciousness is of an immanent, luminous consciousness that informs all things and all lives. We unthinkingly live by fragments of that consciousness, fragments of that energy. But the religious way of life is to live not in terms of the self-interested intentions of this particular body at this particular time, but in terms of the insight of that larger consciousness. There's an important passage in the recently discovered Gnostic Gospel according to St. Thomas. When will the kingdom come? And Christ's disciples ask. In Mark 13, I think it is, we read that the end of the world is about to come. That is to say, a mythological image, that of the end of the world, is there taken as predicting an actual, physical, historical fact to be. But in Thomas's version, Jesus replies, "The kingdom of the Father will not come by expectation. The kingdom of the Father is spread upon the earth, and men do not see it." So I look at you now in that sense, and the radiance of the presence of the divine is known to me through you, through me. Yeah, you, sure. When Jesus says, "He who drinks from my mouth will become as I am, and I shall be he," he's talking from the point of view of that being of beings which we call the Christ, who is the being of all of us. Anyone who lives in relation to that is as Christ. Anyone who brings into his life the message of the Word is equivalent to Jesus. That's the sense of that. So that's what you mean when you say, "I am radiating God to you." You are, yes, and you to me. And I am speaking this seriously. I take it seriously. I do sense that there is divinity in the other. Well, not only that, but what you represent in this conversation and what you're trying to bring out is a realization of these spiritual principles. So you are the vehicle. You are radiant of the Spirit. Is this true for everyone? It is true for everyone who has reached in his life the level of the heart. Do you really believe there is a geography of the psyche? Well, this is a metaphorical language, but you can say that some people are living on the level of the sex organs, and that's all they're living for. That's the meaning of life. This is Freud's philosophy, is it not? Then you come to the Adlerian philosophy of the will to power, that all of life is centered on obstructions and overcoming the obstructions. Well, sure, that's a perfectly good life, and those are forms of divinity also, but they are on the animal level. Then there comes another kind of life which involves giving oneself to others one way or another, and this is the one that's symbolized in the opening of the heart. And what is the source of that life? It must be a recognition of your life in the other, of the one life in the two of us. God is an image for that one life. We ask ourselves where this one life comes from, and people who think everything has to have been made by somebody will think, well, God made it, so God's the source of all this. Well, then, what is religion? The word religion means religio, linking back. If we say it is the one life in both of us, then my separate life has been linked to the one life, religio, linked back. This has become symbolized in the images of religion, which represent that connecting link. Jung, the famous psychologist, says that one of the most powerful religious symbols is the circle. He says that the circle is one of the great primordial images of mankind, and that in considering the symbol of the circle, we are analyzing the self. What do you make of that? The whole world is a circle. All of these circular images reflect the psyche, so there may be some relationship between these architectural designs and the actual structuring of our spiritual functions. When a magician wants to work magic, he puts a circle around himself, and it is within this bounded circle, this hermetically sealed off era, that powers can be brought into play that are lost outside the circle. I remember reading about an Indian chief who said, "When we pitch camp a camp in a circle. When the eagle builds a nest, the nest is in a circle. When we look at the horizon is in a circle. Circles were very important to some Indians, weren't they? Yes, but they're also in much that we've inherited from Sumerian mythology. We've inherited the circle with the 4 cardinal points in 360 degrees. The official Sumerian year was 360 days with 5 holy days that don't count, which are outside of time and in which they had ceremonies relating their society to the heavens. Now we're losing this sense of the circle in relation to time because we have digital time where you just have time buzzing by. Out of the digital, you get the sense of the flow of time. At Penn Station in New York, there's a clock with the hours, the minutes, the seconds, the tenths of seconds, and the hundredths of seconds. But when you see the hundredths of a second buzzing by, you realize how time is running through you. The circle, on the other hand, represents totality. Everything within the circle is one thing, which is encircled and framed. That would be the spatial aspect. But the temporal aspect of the circle is that you leave, you go somewhere, and always come back. God is the Alpha and the Omega, the source and the end. The circle suggests immediately a completed totality, whether in time or in space. How does one worship a metaphor, love a metaphor, die for a metaphor? Well, that's what people are doing all over the place, dying for metaphors. But when you really realize the sound Aum, the sound of the mystery of the word everywhere, then you don't have to go out and die for anything because it's right there all around. Just sit still and see it and experience it and know it. That's a peak experience. Explain Aum. Aum is a word that represents to our ears that sound of the energy of the universe of which all things are manifestations. You start in the back of the mouth, ah, and then oo. You fill the mouth, and closes the mouth. When you pronounce this properly, all vowel sounds are included in the pronunciation, Aum. Consonants are here regarded simply as interruptions of the essential vowel sound. All words are thus fragments of Aum, just as all images are fragments of the form of forms. Aum is a symbolic sound that puts you in touch with that resounding being that is the universe. If you heard some of the recordings of Tibetan monks chanting Aum, you would know what the word means, all right. That's the Aum of being in the world. To be in touch with that and to get to the sense of that is the peak experience of all. A-U-M, Aum, the birth, the coming into being, and the dissolution that cycles back. Aum is called the 4-element syllable. Aum, and what is the 4th element? The silence out of which Aum arises and back into which it goes and which underlies it. My life is the Aum, but there's a silence underlying it too. That is what we would call the immortal. And this is the mortal, and that's the immortal. And there wouldn't be the mortal if there wouldn't the immortal. One must discriminate between the mortal aspect and the immortal aspect of one's own existence. In the experience of my mother and father who are gone, of whom I was born, I have come to understand that there is more than what was our temporal relationship. Of course, there were certain moments in that relationship when an emphatic demonstration of what the relationship was would be brought to my realization. I clearly remember some of those. They stand out as moments of epiphany, of revelation, of the radiance. The meaning is essentially wordless. Yes, words are always qualifications and limitations. And yet, Joe, all we puny human beings are left with is this miserable language, beautiful though it is, that falls short of trying to describe. That's right, and that's why it is a peak experience to break past all that every now and then and to realize, oh, ah.